The night is endless. The sky is black with heavy clouds, and the wind cuts across the frozen earth like a silent blade. Inside the dark shelter of a cave, a small group of people sit close together, their bodies trembling from the relentless cold. The world around them is silent, except for the groan of trees bending under snow, and the distant call of hungry wolves searching for weakness. Every breath feels heavy. Every hour feels longer than the last. Survival hangs by a fragile thread, and yet in the middle of this desperate struggle, a spark bursts to life. A spark unlike anything they have ever known. A flicker of light that pushes back the shadows. A warmth that spreads across frozen hands. A fire that promises safety, strength, and a future. From this single flame begins the greatest turning point in the story of humankind. The moment when winter lost its power and mankind took its first step toward mastering the world. Before the first flame ever lived in human hands, the earth was a place of silence and severity, ruled not by warmth or plenty, but by winters that stretched endlessly across the land. Forests frozen stiff, rivers locked under ice, winds screaming across the plains until skin cracked and bones ached. And in that endless night, small tribes of early people struggled to hold on to life in ways that were fragile, desperate, and always uncertain. For their shelters were shallow defenses, caves that dripped with cold air, huts of branches and hides that sagged beneath the weight of snow, places that dulled the bite of wind, but could not stop the creeping frost that entered the flesh and numbed the spirit, their bodies wrapped in animal skins torn roughly from the hunt, crude layers that trapped a little warmth yet never enough, their breaths rising in heavy clouds as they pressed against one another in darkness, hoping that closeness would do what the world refused to give. And still they shivered through the long nights, unable to sleep deeply, every hour stretched by the sound of wind, the distant call of wolves, the groan of trees bending beneath ice, children restless and crying, elders weak and coughing, hunters silent with hollow eyes that told of hunger and exhaustion, because food was scarce when the snow buried roots and seeds, when herds migrated far beyond reach, when even the streams were sealed, so the cold did not come alone. It came hand in hand with hunger, a double enemy that pressed upon the tribe until every day was a calculation of how many more would last until morning. And yet, in that misery, there were glimpses of something different. Storms that tore across the sky with a flash of lightning and the crack of thunder. Moments when a tree split and burst into flame. A terrifying roar of heat and smoke that drove animals away and glowed fiercely in the night. A sight that filled eyes with both fear and fascination. For within the terror there was warmth. Within the chaos there was safety, predators holding back from the glow, frozen fingers thawing near its edge. And when the flames died down into ash, the memory remained. A thought hidden inside the minds of those who watched. If this could be kept, if this could be made their own, then winter would no longer be the master of every night. But in those early days it was only chance, a gift brought by the sky or the mountain, and tribes tried desperately to carry it. Smouldering sticks clutched tightly, embers protected inside bark or wrapped in leaves. But fire was a demanding ally, fading quickly when starved, raging wildly when fed without care, and again their stolen flames died out, leaving behind only smoke, disappointment, and the bite of cold returning, yet failure became teacher, and each attempt gave rise to another, because unlike any other creature, they were not content to accept the world as it was. They struck stones together, watching sparks leap like tiny stars. They rubbed wood until smoke rose. Their palms blistered and bled. Their lungs burned with the bitter sting of ash. But still they tried, again and again, until one night at last, in one forgotten corner of the earth, sparks caught in dry grass, smoke curled and grew, and from it a fragile flame was born, weak at first, flickering against the breath of the wind, but alive. And as hands shielded it and fed it carefully with twigs and bark, the flame grew steady. It grew strong. And in that moment, the cave that held them was no longer ruled by darkness. Shadows fled from the walls, eyes reflected the glow, skin thawed from the icy numbness, and a warmth unlike anything they had ever known spread through their bodies. A warmth that did not fade as quickly as an embrace, that did not end when the huddled closeness grew tired. A warmth that could be tended, controlled, and shared. And as the flame grew into fire, the night changed forever, for wolves paused at the edge of its glow, uncertain and unwilling to step closer. Food once eaten raw and tough was now held to the heat, softened, made easier to chew, safer to swallow, bellies soothed by the new taste of cooked meat. And sleep came without the shivering, deep and calm around the glow of embers, so that for the first time in memory winter no longer held absolute dominion. The tribe had a companion, a force that lived and breathed with them, a force that gave light to the darkest cave, courage to the weakest hunter, and protection to the smallest child. And though the fire demanded care, fed with wood, guarded against rain, shielded from careless touch, it became the center of every night, a living heart within the tribe, the place where voices gathered, where stories were told, where hands stretched out not in fear but in reverence, and knowledge began to flow from one generation to the next. How to strike flint, how to choose the driest branches, how to blow softly until smoke became flame. Knowledge carried carefully because to lose it meant to return to a world of merciless cold. And as fire spread from one camp to another, humanity began to step beyond mere endurance. No longer a fragile creature at the mercy of every storm, but a people with a light that no winter could ever fully smother. A people whose nights were no longer only nights of fear, but nights of warmth, light, safety, and gathering. And from this one discovery, the entire path of human history turned. For fire was more than survival. It was the first mastery, the first tool that reshaped nature itself. And it marked the moment when mankind ceased to live only by the rules of the world and began to bend the world to human will. A turning point that glowed brighter than any sunrise, a light that even now has never gone out. Once the first flame was born, and the dark cave turned into a chamber of warmth and light, the tribe understood that this fragile miracle could not be taken for granted. For the fire was alive in its own way, hungering for wood, shrinking if starved, raging wildly if fed without care, and the people who had once been helpless against the night now found themselves in the role of caretakers, guardians of something that gave them power, greater than claws or teeth, greater than furs or shelter. And every tribe that discovered fire quickly learned the same truth. Keeping it alive was a responsibility as serious as hunting, as sacred as protecting children, for to lose the flame meant returning to the cold and darkness that had nearly destroyed them. So every night one pair of eyes remained awake, tending to the embers, feeding them carefully with twigs, whispering softly as if the fire were a spirit that needed coaxing. And through this constant watchfulness, a new rhythm of life began to take shape. The flame was never left alone, never allowed to die, carried carefully when the tribe moved, tucked into bundles of bark and moss, embers glowing red as warriors shielded them against wind and rain, women cradling smoldering branches as if they were infants, and sometimes entire groups would divide their duties, hunters guarding not just the tribe, but the glowing heart of fire that they carried with them. For wherever they went, fire had to go too. And this act of carrying flame created the first rituals of care, the first communal task shared by all, binding people together, not just by blood or need, but by devotion to something beyond themselves. And with this devotion came the first spark of culture. Because fire was not simply a tool, it became a symbol, its glow a gathering place that brought voices together, shadows dancing on walls as children sat wide-eyed and listened to elders speak. Stories no longer whispered in darkness but told proudly in the circle of light. Laughter rising where once only fear had echoed, and songs hummed as wood cracked in the flames. So that fire became more than heat. It became memory, a keeper of knowledge. For in its light people passed down the secrets of how to hunt, how to track, how to know the seasons, and most importantly, how to keep the flame alive. And in this way, the knowledge of fire spread not just through tribes, but across generations, ensuring that no child would grow without knowing the sacred art of striking stone, of blowing softly on sparks until they glowed, of stacking wood, so that the flame would never suffocate. And because fire demanded wood, people began to wander differently, no longer chasing only herds or water, but also searching for dry sticks, fallen branches, the bark of certain trees that burned long and steady. And through this search, early humans mapped their world in new ways, marking places where good wood was plentiful, avoiding swamps and rivers where dampness killed the flame, slowly learning to understand the landscape, not only as a place to hunt, but as a place to feed the fire that now fed them. And this constant relationship changed their sense of time itself. For nights were no longer endless stretches of fear. They became chapters marked by glowing embers. Mornings were born from ashes stirred back to life. Days ended with sparks rising like tiny stars into the air. And so life gained rhythm, the rhythm of the fire that pulsed at the heart of the tribe. And yet with this gift came danger. for flames that were left unchecked could turn shelters into traps, caves filled with smoke, huts collapsing in embers, grasslands igniting with fury that drove people running. And so the tribe learned both respect and caution, creating the earliest rules of control. Never feed too much, never sleep before checking the embers, never leave it untended, never let children play too close. And these rules, though simple, were the first laws, the first shared agreements that bound the tribe, not enforced by force but by necessity. Because every life depended on obedience to the fire, and in this obedience people learned cooperation at a level no other creature knew. For wolves and lions hunted together, birds flocked in unison, but humans gathered to guard a flame, to nurture a force outside of themselves. And in nurturing it, they discovered the power of community. For around fire, the tribe was not just a collection of bodies pressed against the cold. It was a family bound by shared purpose. And from this shared purpose came something deeper: identity, pride, the belief that their group was different from others, because they held the flame and others did not. And those who could keep fire alive saw themselves as chosen, blessed, or powerful. And indeed they were, because fire gave them advantages that others lacked, keeping predators away, allowing meat to be stored a little longer through smoke, turning nights of terror into nights of gathering. And as tribes traveled, they carried their fire like a banner, smoke rising above their camps, a signal that they were not prey, but people who held the light. And so the guardianship of fire became a source of unity, responsibility, and strength. And it began to shape not only survival, but the very soul of humanity. For in every ember there was a lesson: that power requires care, that survival is shared, that the smallest spark can light a path through the darkest night, and that by guarding the flame together, the tribe learned what it truly meant to be human. When the tribe first gathered around their fire, its glow seemed only a fragile miracle. Yet as nights turned into seasons, they discovered that this living force was more than warmth and more than comfort. It was also a shield against the predators that once ruled their nights. For wolves that prowled in packs halted at the circle of light, their eyes gleaming yellow in the shadows, yet their paws unwilling to cross the line where flames cracked and sparks rose. Great cats that once stalked silently through the brush growled and circled, but would not come close. Bears that might have torn through hides and bones hesitated at the fire's edge. And in this hesitation, the tribe recognized a new truth: that the flame was not just survival but defense. And so they began to use it as a weapon, holding burning branches in their hands, swinging them with shouts that echoed across the frozen night, driving back creatures many times their size, marking the first time humankind stood against beasts, not with claws or fangs, but with a force that no animal could endure. And with this new weapon came courage. Courage to settle in places once feared, courage to travel longer in search of food, courage to hunt more boldly because they knew the fire would guard their camp when they returned. And soon fire became a tool of strategy. Lines of burning sticks raised at the edges of camps, smoke trails sending signals across distances, circles of flames built to protect sleeping children. And the simple act of carrying a torch became a symbol of safety, for wherever the flame went, predators turned away. And beyond protection, fire gave the hunters a new advantage, for the light revealed what the darkness had hidden. Eyes gleamed at the edge of the forest. Movement betrayed itself in flickers of shadow, and hunters no longer fought blindly against the night, but could strike with precision, spears guided by the glow, stones thrown at shapes made visible. And this mastery over sight gave the tribe power not only to defend, but to control their environment, pushing back the night itself and extending the hours in which they could act, no longer bound by the setting sun, no longer forced into restless silence once darkness fell. And as this realization grew, fire began to take on an even greater role, for it was not only shield and weapon, it was freedom. Freedom to choose when to rest and when to move, freedom to defy the cycle of day and night that had ruled all other creatures. And so, with each burning torch, the tribe announced to the world that they were no longer prey, they were something more. And yet this power carried risks, for the fire that protected them could also turn against them, dry grass igniting and racing across the land, smoke suffocating lungs, embers falling upon shelters and reducing them to ash. And so the tribe learned the art of balance, never raising flames too high near their homes, always clearing ground around the camp, always watching for the wind that could carry sparks into chaos. And this careful balance deepened their respect for the fire, for it could destroy as easily as it could save. and in this respect, they found discipline. A discipline that became part of their culture. Rules of how to wield flame in hunts, how to raise it as warning, how to use smoke to mark territory, how to keep predators wary without inviting ruin, and this mastery slowly turned into ritual. Torches carried proudly at the edges of processions, fires lit deliberately at camp borders, flames raised high during gatherings, symbols that fire was not only practical but sacred, a power that defined their existence. And within this new understanding came the recognition that fire was the first true weapon that belonged solely to humans. Not born in nature, not carved from claw or tooth, but shaped, tamed, and wielded by fragile hands that had once trembled in the dark. And this weapon made them something more than fragile. It made them formidable. And as generations passed, the memory of nights filled with fear gave way to nights filled with confidence. The howls of wolves answered not with trembling, but with firebrands raised defiantly. The growl of a lion countered by the crackle of flame. The cold teeth of winter dulled by glowing embers. And through it all, the tribe began to walk taller, to look at the night not as a master, but as a realm they could cross and conquer. For with fire in their hands, they carried the first true power of humanity, a shield that no beast could pierce, and a weapon that no predator could match. When fire first warmed the bodies of the tribe, it seemed like a miracle of survival. But soon its glow revealed another gift even greater than safety and warmth. For the hunters who returned with raw meat, bloody and tough, placed it near the flames to dry, and found that the flesh softened, juices sizzled, and the air filled with smells unlike anything they had known before. And when they tore into the cooked meat, their jaws did not ache, their stomachs did not twist, and their hunger was filled more fully than ever before. And from this simple discovery, the relationship between humankind and food was transformed, because no longer were they bound to gnaw on sinew and bone with raw effort, no longer forced to swallow tough fibers that sat heavy in their bellies. Instead, the fire broke down what nature had locked away, releasing strength and energy that bodies had never felt so clearly. And this change allowed children to grow stronger, elders to endure longer, hunters to move with renewed vitality. For cooked food gave more than flavor. It gave life itself, and soon the tribe realized that not only meat, but roots and tubers could be softened in the flame. Bitter plants that once scraped throats now turned tender. Grains cracked open when heated. Nuts gave up their oils, and little by little the palette of survival widened, turning the land into a place of hidden offerings, waiting to be unlocked by the patient hand of fire. And this power changed the rhythm of hunting as well. For hunters no longer feared carrying kills long distances, knowing that flesh could be smoked over embers, preserved longer, shared across days. And this preservation meant fewer desperate hunts, fewer nights of starvation, more time to rest and more time to build. And with the sharing of cooked food came new forms of unity. The tribe gathering around flames not only to guard themselves but to eat together, laughter mixing with the crackle of wood, stories flowing as the scent of roasting meat filled the air. And so the fire did more than change food. It created the first meals. Meals not as individual survival but as communal ritual. For in every piece of cooked meat passed from hand to hand, in every root softened and shared, there was a bond forming that no animal knew. A sense that survival was not only about self but about the group. And as this practice spread across time, people began to experiment, learning which woods flavored meat with smoke, which stones held heat best for cooking, which leaves wrapped food so that it roasted gently. And through this experimentation came the earliest whispers of culture, the birth of taste, the beginnings of cuisine. Though they did not know the word, they felt the difference, and they valued the skill of those who knew best how to prepare food in the glow of fire. And this new relationship with nourishment reshaped bodies as well as minds. For cooked food required less chewing, smaller teeth, lighter jaws, and more energy freed for growth of the brain. And in this way, fire did not just feed the body, but expanded the mind, giving rise to sharper memory, greater planning, stronger cooperation, all of which were sustained by the steady energy drawn from the meals shared in the firelight. And the benefits rippled further still, for fire reduced sickness, its heat killing parasites and hidden dangers in raw flesh, saving lives quietly with every roasted bite, allowing more infants to survive, more hunters to recover, more tribes to grow. And with this growth came new stories, new songs, new gatherings around flames that were no longer only guardians of the night, but kitchens of the first human homes, centers of warmth, protection, and nourishment, places where hunger was answered not with desperation, but with abundance. where bellies filled and minds dreamed. And so the mastery of fire over food was not a small step. It was a revolution, a change so deep that it reshaped the very path of humankind, turning fragile survival into the beginnings of thriving, turning raw existence into shared experience. And in the glow of those first roasted meals, the story of humanity took on flavor, richness, and strength that would carry them not only through winters but through the ages to come. Before fire, a cave was only a hollow in stone, cold air pouring in through cracks, dripping water echoing through darkness, and shadows stretching endlessly across jagged walls. And when the night fell, these caves did little more than shield the tribe from wind and snow, yet their hearts still trembled in the silence because predators lingered at the mouth. The damp floor stole warmth from their bodies, and each sound in the dark threatened danger. But when fire was carried into these hollows, everything changed, for the walls glowed amber, the dripping seemed softer, the silence turned into the crackle of burning wood, and fear itself shrank away from the shifting light. And suddenly, the cave was no longer just a refuge from the elements. It became a living chamber of warmth where families huddled not in terror, but in comfort. And the circle of flame at the center shaped the way people gathered, children curling near the embers, hunters stretching sore muscles close to heat, elders resting while their voices filled the air with stories. And in this arrangement, the very idea of shelter shifted, for the tribe no longer saw it only as stone above their heads. They began to see it as a place built around a fire, a hearth that gave the shelter meaning. And when they moved from caves to huts made of branches, hides, and packed earth, they carried this truth with them, always placing fire at the center, always arranging their beds and tools around its glow, stacking wood carefully for the long night, leaving gaps in the roof to let smoke climb into the stars, shaping doors not just to block the wind, but to guard the flame. And with this practice, the hut was not only a barrier against cold, but a vessel for warmth, a circle where every member of the tribe could feel the flame's reach. And this presence bound them to their shelters in a way no raw cave ever had. For now they did not wander endlessly from hollow to hollow. They mended roofs, patched walls, and returned night after night to the same glowing heart, guarding the fire as they guarded children, protecting embers as they protected food. And this new loyalty was the seed of permanence, the first whisper of settlement, for when fire burned steadily inside a shelter, that place became more than temporary. It became theirs, and in this permanence grew community, for voices gathered in the warmth. Laughter followed the rhythm of sparks, and shadows cast by the fire danced across walls like living spirits, teaching children without words, reminding hunters of victories, and giving elders a stage to paint memory in stories that lived longer than their breath. And thus shelter became more than survival. It became the center of culture, the space where wisdom passed from one generation to the next. And over seasons the fire hut bond grew sacred, for the hearth not only cooked food and gave light, it became the tribe's identity. Its ashes the memory of countless meals, its smoke the signal of life rising above the snow. And even when the tribe moved on, they carried glowing embers carefully in bark or stone, because they could rebuild walls anywhere. But without fire, those walls meant nothing. And wherever they stopped, the first task was not to gather stone or hide. It was to place the fire at the heart and build outward, repeating the circle of safety and belonging. And this repetition etched itself into the human mind. The instinct that a true home is not only walls or roof, but the hearth that warms it. An instinct that flowed through centuries, shaping villages with central fire pits, shaping houses with fireplaces, shaping modern homes with stoves and lamps. Because from the beginning, shelter was never complete without fire. And so, the flame that once trembled weakly in the cold became the very design of home itself, transforming caves into living spaces, huts into hearths, and survival into belonging, until to think of home was to think of fire burning steady within, eternal, unyielding, and alive. Before the discovery of fire, the coming of night was the greatest enemy humankind had ever known. For when the sun dipped beyond the horizon and darkness rolled across the frozen plains, there was no safety, no comfort, only silence broken by the howl of wolves and the endless whisper of wind through dead branches. And in that silence, people huddled together in caves or beneath crude shelters, their bodies pressed tightly, not for closeness, but for fear, for the dark was thick and merciless. A place where sight failed, where predators prowled unseen, and where every heartbeat carried the dread of not surviving until dawn. But when fire was brought into the night, something extraordinary happened, because the flames did not fade when the sun vanished. They lived on, glowing steadily, holding back the black curtain of the void, and for the first time in history, humankind looked upon the night not as a master, but as a canvas they could shape. And so the hours that were once empty with terror slowly filled with ritual, because people now gathered around the circle of light, not only to survive but to live, to share, to remember, and to dream. And at first, it began simply with exhausted hunters recounting the path of the chase, telling where the herd had fled, where danger had struck, where food could be found again. And these words, carried by firelight, were not forgotten like murmurs in the dark. They were etched into memory by the glow that made every story vivid, every lesson lasting. And soon elders began to shape the raw facts of survival into something greater, layering them with rhythm, with structure, with meaning, until the stories became teaching, and teaching became tradition, and tradition became culture. And thus the night was no longer silence. It was filled with the voices of people weaving memory into narrative. Children leaning against the warmth of their mothers to listen, their eyes wide, their fears soothed by words that gave order to the chaos of the world. And while words flowed, shadows joined them, flickering across cave walls and turning stone into stage, where firelight painted wolves with glowing eyes, hunters with spears, rivers flowing in streaks of light and darkness. And those shadows were more than entertainment. They were lessons alive, stories enacted before the eyes of the tribe, a theatre of survival, a mirror of the hunt and the struggle. And these shadows imprinted themselves deeply on the young, ensuring that the wisdom of experience never vanished, but passed down like flame itself. And with this union of voice and light, the tribe discovered a new power, the power of imagination given form by fire. For in the hours when the land outside froze and predators circled unseen, inside the cave minds wandered far, reaching into memory, into possibility, into futures not yet lived. And so night turned from an enemy into a teacher, a wellspring of culture, and the fire was its heartbeat, its glowing center, never silent, always speaking through crackle and spark, through smoke curling into the sky as if carrying prayers. And slowly ritual deepened, with some tending to embers carefully through the long hours, others leading chants or simple songs that rose and fell with the flames, rhythms that calmed restless hearts, filling the cold with sound that made the group feel whole. And in those chants the tribe discovered another truth, that harmony could be created not only in the hunt but in voice, that unity could be heard and felt, and that unity gave strength greater than any spear. For when voices joined in the glow of fire, fear dissolved, and sleep came not as a collapse of exhaustion, but as a gentle surrender, because the embers glowed like eyes watching over them, and the crackle of flame was like the breath of a guardian. And for the first time in history, the night was restful, peaceful, and safe. And from this safety came dreams, dreams that shaped memory, imagination, and creativity, dreams that built stories even richer than those spoken. And so fire gave humankind not only warmth, not only food, not only defense, but the gift of ritual that transformed empty hours into the foundation of culture. The time when knowledge was shared, when bonds deepened, when memory was carved into the hearts of the tribe, and when survival turned into life, into meaning, into identity. And thus every night became more than darkness endured. It became a circle of connection, where humanity itself was born in story, shadow and flame. A circle that still lives today wherever people gather around firelight, speaking, remembering, and refusing to let the night silence their voices. In the time before fire, survival was lonely, for even when groups of people gathered under the same cave roof, or huddled beneath the same skins, fear made them inward, each one listening for predators in the dark, each one guarding only their own breath. And though bodies pressed close for warmth, hearts remained apart. But when fire entered the circle of human life, everything changed, because the flame was not only heat and light, it was a center, a focus, a point around which people could gather not as scattered individuals but as one body. And as they sat shoulder to shoulder in the glow of the flames, they no longer stared outward into the black where danger lurked. They looked inward toward one another, and in that simple shift, the meaning of community was born. For around fire, food was shared, roasted flesh passed from hand to hand, roots softened in the coals divided equally. Children fed before hunters ate. Elders offered the choicest portions, and this act of sharing forged bonds deeper than any blood alone, because survival was no longer the burden of the individual, but the strength of the group. And in the glow of the flames, words were spoken not only of fear and warning, but of gratitude, of encouragement, of comfort. And through these exchanges, people felt the power of unity, knowing that they were not alone against the cold world, but carried together by the warmth of many hands. And soon, the fire became the anchor of rituals that tied the group into something larger than themselves. For it was there that disputes were settled in the light, where all could see. There that decisions were made by voices joining together. There that plans for the hunt or the journey were whispered into shape. And the fire listened to it all, a silent witness to the birth of cooperation. And in that cooperation, humanity grew, because with many voices and many hands joined in purpose, tasks once impossible became possible. Great hunts could be organized, shelters strengthened, paths remembered, dangers avoided, and every step of this strength was built in the circle of the fire. And as these gatherings repeated across countless winters, the fire came to symbolize trust itself. For those who sat in its warmth shared not only food, but safety. And even strangers once wary were welcome to its edge. For to share fire was to share life. And in this act, the foundation of hospitality was laid. The first sign of peace, the first promise that even in a harsh world, a circle of warmth could be extended to another. And this trust deepened into bonds that lasted beyond the flame. Bonds of loyalty, bonds of kinship, bonds of belonging. And as tribes grew larger, the hearth became their center, its smoke rising into the sky as a signal of life, its glow seen from afar as a beacon to those returning from the hunt, guiding them back not only to shelter but to people, to family, to community. And in this way, fire gave humanity more than survival. It gave them identity, for no one belonged to the cold wilderness. No one belonged to the empty night. They belonged to the fire and to the circle it created. And this belonging grew so deeply rooted that it echoed across ages, into villages built around central hearths, into towns gathered around communal fires, into the very idea that people are strongest not alone but together. And all of it began in the first moments when fire turned frightened bodies pressed in silence into a circle of voices, laughter, and shared warmth. And so the bond of community was born in the glow of flames, fragile at first, then steady, then unbreakable, as eternal as the fire itself. Before fire, humans were bound to the shelters they could find, caves and hollows that offered the bare minimum of protection. And even when they ventured out, the night and cold dictated their movement, forcing them to return long before darkness fell, forcing them to avoid distant hunting grounds or unfamiliar valleys. But with fire, everything changed, for the warmth of the flame, carried carefully in embers and torches, extended the reach of human presence beyond familiar boundaries. And suddenly the cold night was no longer a barrier, but a challenge that could be met. For wherever fire was brought, warmth and light followed, allowing hunters to travel farther, scouts to explore unknown lands, and families to relocate without surrendering comfort or safety. And this capability reshaped the concept of territory itself, because humans could now occupy spaces that were once too harsh, too dark, too distant. And with fire as both shield and guide, the landscape became an extension of the tribe's reach. Every forest path and frozen river mapped in relation to the places where flame could be maintained. Every valley chosen not only for shelter, but for the availability of wood, dry grass, and safe fire sites. And as groups moved farther, they left signals, smoke rising to alert others of presence, sparks carried from one camp to the next, and the first networks of habitation began to emerge, connecting people across miles of icy land, creating the earliest signs of community across territory, while the fire itself offered confidence to attempt risks that had once been unimaginable. For a torch in hand meant protection from wolves, guidance in darkness, and a visible boundary against enemies or rival groups. And with this protection came courage. Courage to cross rivers, frozen solid, to climb ridges where wind tore through bodies, to explore caves that had never been entered. And every step taken with fire strengthened knowledge of the world, because light revealed tracks, shadows revealed predators, smoke carried signals, and heat allowed nights to be endured far from the central cave. And in this way, fire became both extension and tool, not only illuminating the path but shaping it, defining the limits of human movement. And as generations passed, this mastery over territory was ingrained in memory and ritual, the locations of reliable firewood and safe embers recorded in spoken story, the best travel routes shared around nightly flames, the hazards of the land narrated to children who would one day carry torches into new territory themselves. And this knowledge created a sense of confidence and belonging in vast lands, because fire made distant places familiar, made risk manageable, made the unknown navigable. And through these journeys, the tribe learned the first lessons of planning, logistics, and strategy, understanding not only where to go, but when, how long, and with what supplies, all revolving around the essential life of flame. And with fire's influence, survival was no longer reactive but proactive. Humans became architects of movement, explorers of night and cold, and innovators of survival, pushing beyond previous limits, claiming land that had once seemed impossible. And in doing so, they began to feel the first sense of dominion over their environment, not through brute force alone, but through the controlled and careful application of fire, a power that transformed the land from hostile wilderness into a stage for human endeavor. And in every spark carried across snowfields, every circle of warmth established in a new cave or hut, every torch raised in the darkness, the story of expansion unfolded, teaching that with knowledge, courage, and the steady guidance of fire, humans could shape the very reach of their world, turning night and winter from imprisoning forces into challenges that could be met, endured, and conquered. And thus the flame became not only a guardian of life, but the beacon of human ambition, lighting the path of exploration and creating the first true sense that the earth itself could be traveled, mapped, and understood. When fire became a constant companion, it did more than warm bodies or cook meals. It became a catalyst for invention. For as humans watched flames dance and coals glow, they began to notice changes in materials touched by heat. Rocks cracked in the fire, wood hardened or charred, bones became easier to shape, and suddenly the world presented itself as malleable, responsive, and transformable. And this observation sparked the first deliberate attempts to use fire as a toolmaker. For sticks thrown into the embers could be hardened into spears that held longer. Bones placed near the heat could be shaped into needles, hooks, or small cutting implements, and stones heated in fire became brittle enough to flake into sharp edges, creating cutting tools previously unimaginable. And the understanding that fire could alter matter intentionally led to a new kind of experimentation, a deliberate effort to test which woods, bones, and stones responded best, how long to expose them, at what angle to strike, and the results were recorded not in writing, but in memory, in repetition, in careful teaching of the young by elders who had mastered these techniques. And through these lessons, the tribe not only survived more effectively, but began to exert influence over its environment, shaping it rather than merely enduring it. Because now humans could fashion implements that gave them advantage over prey, predators, and the land itself. And with these new tools, hunting became more precise, processing food became faster and safer, shelters could be reinforced with sharpened stakes, and barriers could be created that extended the safety of fire outward into the surrounding terrain. And in learning to manipulate fire for toolmaking, the tribe discovered the first lessons of cause and effect, patience, precision, and planning, understanding that heat could be stored, controlled, and applied methodically. That failure taught more than success. And that knowledge shared across the group increased the survival of all. And as these practices were passed down, the community became more cohesive. For the creation and use of tools required cooperation, observation, and shared responsibility. Everyone from hunters to children, learning to respect the power of flame, not only for warmth, but as a force of transformation. And this respect fostered discipline, focus, and ingenuity, qualities that would define humanity for millennia. And with every sharpened stone, every hardened spear, every tool shaped by heat, humans learned that the world could be bent, altered, and improved. That survival was not a passive state, but an active engagement with the environment. And that fire was the key to this engagement, for it allowed materials to respond to will, allowed ideas to take physical form, and allowed knowledge to be preserved through practice, demonstration, and oral tradition. And in this way, fire became more than a companion, more than a protector, more than a provider. It became the first true instrument of innovation, a teacher of science, a sculptor of human ingenuity, and the spark that bridged instinct and intellect, allowing the tribe not only to endure winter, but to master the world around them in ways no other creature could. And through this mastery, the seeds of technology, experimentation, and culture were planted, all beginning with the simple observation that heat could shape wood, stone, and bone, and from there imagination, skill, and survival merged into the earliest human tools, forging the path that would carry generations forward. empowered by fire's transformative force. Once fire became central to daily life, it did more than warm bodies, cook food, and ward off predators. It reshaped the very structure of human society. For with the flame at the center of every shelter and camp, certain tasks became necessary, and humans began to take on distinct roles. Responsibilities that ensured the survival of the tribe and the continuity of fire itself. Some became fire tenders, watching embers through the long night, feeding it patiently with twigs and bark, coaxing sparks to grow into warmth without letting the flames rage uncontrolled. And this role demanded vigilance, skill, and patience, qualities that elevated the individual in the eyes of the group, while others specialized in hunting, gathering food to feed not only themselves but those who protected the flame, synchronizing their movements with the rhythms of fire care. And children learned early that they too had a part to play, carrying small sticks to feed embers, watching quietly, imitating elders, learning through observation and practice that survival was a shared responsibility. And as generations passed, these roles became more defined, creating the first sense of hierarchy not imposed by force but by necessity. For those who mastered tending the fire or crafting tools were respected, sought for advice, their skill recognized as essential, and the distribution of work brought efficiency and security. For the tribe knew that if each member performed their task faithfully, the circle of survival expanded, warmth reached all bodies, food was sufficient, and danger could be mitigated. And within this framework, communication deepened, for fire required coordination, observation, and reporting. And as tasks became interdependent, trust and accountability grew, teaching humans the first lessons in social organization, leadership, and cooperation. And with leadership came planning, because managing the fire, the food, the safety of the group over weeks and months required foresight, strategy, and discussion. And in these conversations, decisions were debated, priorities set, and roles adjusted according to skill and need. And from these practices arose respect, mentorship, and the earliest forms of governance, all orbiting around the central life of the flame. And as rituals developed around the fire, roles were reinforced through ceremony, with elders instructing apprentices in the art of fire care, hunters demonstrating tracking in the firelight, women passing on knowledge of preparing food, crafting tools and weaving shelter, while children observed, imitating, and gradually assuming responsibility, and the entire community became a web of interlocking duties. Each role vital, each life strengthened by the cohesion the fire created. And through this cohesion, humans experienced security not simply as individuals, but as part of a collective, understanding that their survival and comfort depended not only on their own skill, but on the diligence, strength, and wisdom of their companions. And the fire itself became a symbol of this interdependence, a living representation of the need for collaboration, patience, and care, so that every spark preserved, every meal shared, every ember tended reinforced the social structure, teaching lessons that would echo across millennia, forming the basis of culture, law, and community. And in this way, fire did more than light the night or warm the body. It illuminated the very organization of human life, defined responsibilities, created trust, and gave birth to the idea that society itself is a network of interdependent roles, a lesson born in the flickering glow of embers, witnessed by generations, and carried forward by every hand that reached into the flame to keep it alive. Before the discovery and mastery of fire, the night was a time of constant vigilance, a period marked by discomfort, cold, and fear. For when darkness descended upon the frozen landscape, humans huddled together in caves, in hollows, beneath fragile shelters, their bodies pressed tightly not for comfort but for survival, ears straining to detect the faintest snap of a branch, eyes wide and unrelenting in the shadows, hearts beating rapidly at every distant howl or rustle in the underbrush. And sleep, when it came, was shallow, fragmented, punctuated by sudden awakenings, nightmares, and the persistent knowledge that predators lurked just beyond sight, ready to exploit the slightest lapse in attention. And in such conditions, the body and mind were never fully at rest. Strength was conserved, but never replenished. The brain remained alert in ways that kept the organism alive, but prevented true regeneration. And with each night spent in this constant tension, the limitations of human survival were painfully clear. The cold sapping energy, the darkness keeping hunters from distant opportunities, the fear narrowing vision and thought. And yet with the discovery of fire, a profound transformation began, because fire introduced warmth, light and rhythm into the night, turning a hostile, unpredictable void into a space humans could manipulate and control. And as the flames rose, crackled, and spread their glow across walls, the body felt immediate relief. Heat penetrating muscles that had stiffened from cold, coals radiating energy that made the skin tingle with comfort. And the mind responded to this physical reassurance with a relaxation it had never known. For the circle of fire created a sense of safety, the glow serving as a constant sentinel against darkness, predators, and the unknown. And as humans sat or lay within this luminous circle, the brain began to recognize periods of rest as genuinely restorative, gradually allowing sleep to deepen, becoming longer, less fragmented, and more predictable. While the fire's steady presence created environmental cues that regulated circadian rhythms, its warmth signaling the body that the night could be endured safely, its light defining spaces for wakefulness, storytelling, and communal activities, and its slow dying into embers marking the passage of hours in a gentle, natural rhythm, which allowed humans to synchronize sleep and activity in ways that optimized energy expenditure, learning, and growth. And as this new pattern stabilized over generations, humans began to experience deeper REM cycles, longer periods of unconsciousness that permitted memory consolidation, emotional processing, and mental recovery, which in turn enhanced hunting skills, spatial awareness, and social cognition during waking hours. And beyond the purely physical and cognitive benefits, fire changed the psychological experience of sleep, replacing terror with tranquility, anxiety with ritual, and chaos with structure. For the night now contained predictable phases, from preparation for rest, tending of embers, and communal storytelling, to quiet reflection by the dying glow, to deep slumber in the safety of warmth. And in this transformation, sleep itself became a tool for survival, a mechanism by which strength, strategy, and cooperation could be preserved across the next day, the next hunt, and the next generation. And the social dimension of this change cannot be overstated, because with fire-centered sleep, humans learned to organize themselves around rest, protecting one another, sharing warmth, and coordinating shifts if necessary to guard the embers, creating the earliest forms of social vigilance that allowed some members to rest fully while others remained watchful, establishing a rhythm of collective security that amplified the effectiveness of the group and reinforced bonds of trust and interdependence. And in the quiet hours when sleep deepened, the fire's glow, fading to embers, served as a final guardian, a psychological buffer against fear, marking the transition from active awareness to unconscious restoration, while the residual warmth maintained metabolic stability, preventing hypothermia and conserving calories. And as these cycles repeated over countless nights, the human body adapted, optimizing fat metabolism, muscle recovery, and neural plasticity, and the mind began to leverage these longer, safer sleep periods for complex cognitive functions, from planning and memory recall to problem-solving and imagination, laying the groundwork for abstract thought, storytelling, and innovation, which would later manifest in tool-making, social strategy, and cultural development. And in this way, fire fundamentally reshaped the sleep landscape, transforming it from a necessary but dangerous pause into a predictable, restorative, and socially integrated state, where humans not only survived the night, but used it as an incubator for growth, learning, and community cohesion. A transformation so profound that it affected every aspect of life, from hunting and gathering efficiency to child development, from elder guidance to group decision-making, and all of this occurred within the glowing circle of flame, where heat, light, and vigilance converged to create the first truly human experience of sleep, one in which the body could rest fully, the mind could dream safely, and the tribe could endure not just the night, but the generations. For the mastery of fire over darkness, cold, and fear was not merely a technological achievement. It was the foundation upon which the human capacity for organized rest, advanced cognition, and cultural complexity was built. And the echoes of this transformation still resonate today in the rituals, routines, and comforts humans construct around sleep, hearths, and warmth. Because the circle of fire that allowed cavemen to sleep in the depths of freezing winters created patterns of rest and security that define humanity itself, turning the night from an enemy into a landscape of possibility, regeneration, and continuity, and ensuring that the evolution of mind, body, and society could advance without the constant interruption of terror, hunger, or hypothermia, establishing the fundamental link between fire, sleep, and survival that has carried every human generation forward into the present. Before fire, the human mind was primarily bound to immediate survival, responding instinctively to hunger, cold, and danger, perceiving the world in terms of threat and opportunity. And yet, within this framework, the capacity for imagination was latent, restricted by constant vigilance and environmental pressures. For there was little time or safety to envision beyond the next meal, the next shelter, or the next predator. But when fire was discovered and mastered, the landscape of the mind itself began to shift, because the glow of the flame created a space of both safety and wonder, a circle in which humans could relax their vigilance enough to observe, reflect, and connect. And as they watched sparks drift into the air, shadows twist and merge across the walls, and the coals fade and flare unpredictably, a spark of creativity ignited within the mind, for the flame demonstrated change, transformation, and possibility in a tangible, immediate form, and the brain began to register patterns, rhythms, and sequences, understanding causality in new ways, recognizing that input could be transformed into output, that effort produced result, that manipulation of the environment could create predictable or surprising effects. And this understanding laid the groundwork for symbolic thought, abstraction, and planning, because fire was not just a tool for survival. It was a living, dynamic entity whose behavior could be observed, studied, and incorporated into mental models. And as humans shared the flame within their shelters, sitting in the circle of warmth and light, they began to narrate, to gesture, to describe, to speculate. And in these exchanges, imagination grew collectively, as stories extended beyond the immediate reality, exploring events not yet experienced, lessons not yet learned, or dangers not yet faced. And these early narratives carried metaphor, symbolism, and projection, teaching the young to understand patterns of nature, the behavior of prey, the habits of predators, and the cycles of weather, while also creating a mental space for creativity, curiosity, and problem-solving. For to imagine was to prepare, and preparation enhanced survival. And as fire illuminated their faces, the tribe began to notice shadows dancing on cave walls, shapes that could be interpreted as animals, spirits, or exaggerated forms. And these interpretations encouraged symbolic thinking, allowing humans to link images, ideas, and concepts in ways never possible before, to recognize analogies, to plan strategies, to invent tools for needs not yet urgent. And as the nights passed, this symbolic play became ritualized, with stories retold, gestures repeated, patterns memorized, creating a foundation for culture, art, and language, all emerging in the luminous circle of the flame, where imagination was nurtured by safety and repetition, where the unpredictable movements of coals and sparks provided infinite variation for observation, where curiosity could be expressed without immediate risk, and where minds could begin to explore ideas beyond the constraints of raw survival, connecting past experience with future possibility. And these imaginative exercises strengthened cognitive capacities, memory, attention, and foresight, allowing humans to anticipate danger, manipulate tools in new ways, plan hunts over days or weeks, and innovate strategies for shelter, fire management, and food preservation. And as these practices spread, the social aspect of imagination grew, for shared storytelling around fire created communal memory, the earliest archives of experience and wisdom. And as different minds contributed observations, embellishments, and lessons, the human capacity for creativity and collaboration expanded, establishing the first rudimentary cultural institutions, teaching that imagination was not only personal but social, enhancing survival for all. And even the aesthetics of fire, the color of flames, the glow of embers, the curling smoke, stimulated appreciation, curiosity, and emotional connection, generating early forms of artistic sensibility. And in this fertile environment, problem-solving evolved, for the observation that fire could transform materials inspired humans to experiment with rocks, bones, hides, and wood, to combine elements in ways that extended utility, durability, and efficiency, while simultaneously reinforcing abstract thinking and planning. And thus fire became a teacher of cause and effect, a muse for creativity, and a catalyst for symbolic cognition, demonstrating that humans were capable of envisioning beyond immediate necessity, anticipating outcomes, and constructing mental models of the world, while also providing a safe stage for collective exploration of ideas, fears, hopes, and strategies. And in this convergence of warmth, light, social interaction, and observation, the human imagination was awakened in ways that allowed culture, art, technology, and ritual to flourish, planting seeds that would eventually grow into complex language, myth, science, and philosophy, and all of this was rooted in the simple act of gathering around the flame, watching its movement, interpreting its patterns, and sharing experience, proving that fire did not only preserve life physically, but transformed it mentally and culturally, giving humans the ability to see beyond the immediate, to connect the abstract to the tangible, to learn from observation and experimentation, and to collectively envision a future shaped by intelligence, creativity, and cooperation, making the mastery of fire not just a survival tool, but the crucible in which the human mind itself was forged, a force that would define generations, inspire civilization, and illuminate the path from instinct to imagination, from reaction to innovation, and from mere survival to the creation of culture, thought, and endless possibility. Once fire became a steady presence in human life, it quickly evolved beyond mere survival, warmth, and illumination. For the glow of the flame began to inspire behaviors, routines, and gatherings that were increasingly formalized. And as the circle of fire expanded to accommodate entire families and extended groups, humans began to recognize the flame as more than a tool or source of comfort, perceiving it as a sacred, central, and almost living entity. And from this recognition arose the earliest forms of ritual, the conscious repetition of gestures, words, and practices around the fire that both celebrated its power and ensured its continuity. For tending the flame became not only a practical task, but a moral and symbolic one, a duty performed with reverence because the survival of all depended upon it. And as this reverence spread, patterns of behavior emerged that transcended immediate necessity, with sequences of fire preparation, feeding, and extinguishing followed with careful precision, almost ceremonial in nature. And during the evenings, as families and bands gathered around the fire's steady glow, storytelling evolved into structured narration. Songs were composed, chants repeated, movements coordinated, and with each repetition, the acts acquired meaning beyond utility, marking the earliest forms of social cohesion, cultural identity, and shared memory. And these rituals also served educational purposes, allowing elders to pass knowledge of hunting, gathering, tracking, weather, and navigation to younger members in a structured and memorable way, their words enhanced by the dance of flames across faces and cave walls, while shadows provided visual reinforcement, creating a sensory richness that deeply imprinted lessons into memory. And beyond education, the fire rituals allowed for emotional regulation and bonding, as laughter, grief, celebration, and warning were expressed collectively, giving rise to empathy, trust, and social norms that governed behavior, reinforced loyalty, and structured group interactions, while the placement of members around the flame established spatial hierarchies and roles. Those who tended the fire, who led stories, or who controlled the hearth's rhythm became natural leaders, while observers learned respect and patience, and children absorbed these structures as an implicit curriculum in social responsibility, cooperation, and communal awareness. And the fire itself acted as both teacher and witness, illuminating faces, projecting shadows, providing warmth and safety, while simultaneously embodying authority, continuity, and power. And in this environment, humans began to experiment with symbolism, embellishment, and pattern, decorating hearths, arranging stones or sticks in deliberate forms, accentuating stories with rhythmic gestures or repeated sounds, recognizing that the fire's presence could enhance attention, emotion, and memory. And over countless nights, these acts crystallized into ritualized patterns, ceremonies with beginnings, middles, and ends, sometimes marking seasonal cycles, successful hunts, or significant life events. And as these ceremonial practices became ingrained, humans developed an acute awareness of shared experience, immediate form, and the brain began to register patterns, rhythms, and sequences, understanding causality in new ways, recognizing that input could be transformed into output, that effort produced result, that manipulation of the environment could create predictable or surprising effects. And this understanding laid the groundwork for symbolic thought, abstraction, and planning, because fire was not just a tool for survival. It was a living, dynamic entity whose behavior could be observed, studied, and incorporated into mental models. And as humans shared the flame within their shelters, sitting in the circle of warmth and light, they began to narrate, to gesture, to describe, to speculate. And in these exchanges, imagination grew collectively, as stories extended beyond the immediate reality, exploring events not yet experienced, lessons not yet learned, or dangers not yet faced. And these early narratives carried metaphor, symbolism, and projection, teaching the young to understand patterns of nature, the behavior of prey, the habits of predators, and the cycles of weather, while also creating a mental space for creativity, curiosity, and problem solving, for to imagine was to prepare, and preparation enhanced survival. And as fire illuminated their faces, the tribe began to notice shadows dancing on cave walls, shapes that could be interpreted as animals, spirits, or exaggerated forms. And these interpretations encouraged symbolic thinking, allowing humans to link images, ideas, and concepts in ways never possible before, to recognize analogies, to plan strategies, to invent tools for needs not yet urgent. And as the nights passed, this symbolic play became ritualized, with stories retold, gestures repeated, patterns memorized, creating a foundation for culture, art, and language, all emerging in the luminous circle of the flame, where imagination was nurtured by safety and repetition, where the unpredictable movements of coals and sparks provided infinite variation for observation, where curiosity could be expressed without immediate risk, and where minds could begin to explore ideas beyond the constraints of raw survival, connecting past experience with future possibility. And these imaginative exercises strengthened cognitive capacities, memory, attention, and foresight, allowing humans to anticipate danger, manipulate tools in new ways, plan hunts over days or weeks, and innovate strategies for shelter, fire management, and food preservation. And as these practices spread, the social aspect of imagination grew. For shared storytelling around fire created communal memory, the earliest archives of experience and wisdom. And as different minds contributed observations, embellishments, and lessons, the human capacity for creativity and collaboration expanded, establishing the first rudimentary cultural institutions, teaching that imagination was not only personal but social, enhancing survival for all, and even the aesthetics of fire, the color of flames, the glow of embers, the curling smoke, stimulated appreciation, curiosity, and emotional connection, generating early forms of artistic sensibility. And in this fertile environment, problem-solving evolved, for the observation that fire could transform materials inspired humans to experiment with rocks, bones, hides, and wood, to combine elements in ways that extended utility, durability, and efficiency, while simultaneously reinforcing abstract thinking and planning. And thus fire became a teacher of cause and effect, a muse for creativity, and a catalyst for symbolic cognition, demonstrating that humans were capable of envisioning beyond immediate necessity, anticipating outcomes, and constructing mental models of the world, while also providing a safe stage for collective exploration of ideas, fears, hopes, and strategies. And in this convergence of warmth, light, social interaction, and observation, the human imagination was awakened in ways that allowed culture, art, technology, and ritual to flourish, planting seeds that would eventually grow into complex language, myth, science, and philosophy. And all of this was rooted in the simple act of gathering around the flame, watching its movement, interpreting its patterns, and sharing experience, proving that fire did not only preserve life physically, but transformed it mentally and culturally, giving humans the ability to see beyond the immediate, to connect the abstract to the tangible, to learn from observation and experimentation, and to collectively envision a future shaped by intelligence, creativity, and cooperation, making the mastery of fire not just a survival tool, but the crucible in which the human mind itself was forged, a force that would define generations, inspire civilization, and illuminate the path from instinct to imagination, from reaction to innovation, and from mere survival to the creation of culture, thought, and endless possibility. Once fire became a steady presence in human life, it quickly evolved beyond mere survival, warmth, and illumination. For the glow of the flame began to inspire behaviors, routines, and gatherings that were increasingly formalized. And as the circle of fire expanded to accommodate entire families and extended groups, humans began to recognize the flame as more than a tool or source of comfort, perceiving it as a sacred, central, and almost living entity. And from this recognition arose the earliest forms of ritual, the conscious repetition of gestures, words, and practices around the fire that both celebrated its power and ensured its continuity. For tending the flame became not only a practical task, but a moral and symbolic one, a duty performed with reverence because the survival of all depended upon it. And as this reverence spread, patterns of behavior emerged that transcended immediate necessity, with sequences of fire preparation, feeding, and extinguishing followed with careful precision, almost ceremonial in nature. And during the evenings, as families and bands gathered around the fire's steady glow, storytelling evolved into structured narration. Songs were composed, chants repeated, movements coordinated, and with each repetition, the acts acquired meaning beyond utility, marking the earliest forms of social cohesion, cultural identity, and shared memory. And these rituals also served educational purposes, allowing elders to pass knowledge of hunting, gathering, tracking, weather, and navigation to younger members in a structured and memorable way, their words enhanced by the dance of flames across faces and cave walls, while shadows provided visual reinforcement, creating a sensory richness that deeply imprinted lessons into memory. And beyond education, the fire rituals allowed for emotional regulation and bonding, as laughter, grief, celebration, and warning were expressed collectively, giving rise to empathy, trust, and social norms that governed behavior, reinforced loyalty, and structured group interactions, while the placement of members around the flame established spatial hierarchies and roles. Those who tended the fire, who led stories, or who controlled the hearth's rhythm became natural leaders, while observers learned respect and patience, and children absorbed these structures as an implicit curriculum in social responsibility, cooperation, and communal awareness. And the fire itself acted as both teacher and witness, illuminating faces, projecting shadows, providing warmth and safety, while simultaneously embodying authority, continuity, and power. And in this environment, humans began to experiment with symbolism, embellishment, and pattern, decorating hearths, arranging stones or sticks in deliberate forms, accentuating stories with rhythmic gestures or repeated sounds, recognizing that the fire's presence could enhance attention, emotion, and memory. And over countless nights, these acts crystallized into ritualized patterns, ceremonies with beginnings, middles, and ends, sometimes marking seasonal cycles, successful hunts, or significant life events. And as these ceremonial practices became ingrained, humans developed an acute awareness of shared experience, of participation in something larger than themselves, of alignment of body, voice, and thought with collective meaning. And this awareness fostered cohesion, identity, and purpose, and as rituals grew in complexity, they began to differentiate roles more clearly, designating individuals to lead, to guide, to observe, to execute specific tasks, to maintain fire, and to prepare the circle for the communal experience, establishing the first formal social stratification grounded in cultural necessity rather than arbitrary force. And as songs, stories, and gestures were repeated across generations, they became repositories of knowledge, culture, and memory, embedding survival strategies, moral lessons, and social rules in forms that were compelling, memorable, and emotionally resonant. And through this continuous practice, fire-centered rituals created a shared symbolic universe, where the flame itself represented life, safety, knowledge, and continuity, while shadows, smoke, and sparks became metaphors, illustrations, and signs. And as humans danced, chanted, sang, and spoke around the hearth, they were simultaneously performing, observing, and internalizing lessons in morality, cooperation, history, and imagination, while at the same time reinforcing the physiological and psychological benefits of warmth, security, and regulated sleep. And this integration of practical, cognitive, social, and symbolic functions transformed the human experience. For survival was no longer a mere fight against cold, hunger, or predators. It became a coordinated, culturally mediated, ritualized process that integrated mind, body, and community. And in this crucible of flame-centered activity, humans developed not only skill, knowledge, and survival strategies, but also the earliest forms of art, religion, and identity, learning that through shared ritual, experience could be preserved, transmitted, and celebrated, and that the fire itself was both medium and symbol, the center around which life, memory, and imagination could converge for every ember tended, every story told, every shadow watched, and every song sung reinforced both survival and culture. And with repeated practice, these patterns became instinctive, laying the foundation for the complex social, spiritual, and artistic structures that would define humanity in the millennia to come, proving that the mastery of fire was not merely a technological achievement, but the central force that transformed human life from a collection of individuals into a community, from survival alone into culture, from darkness and fear into a space of meaning, shared experience, and ritualized continuity, and ensuring that every generation thereafter would inherit not only the skills to endure the world, but the tools to shape it symbolically. socially and spiritually around the eternal glow of flame. Before the mastery of fire, survival was an immediate reactive process, dictated by the unpredictability of weather, predators, and food scarcity, with humans forced to rely almost entirely on instinct, keen observation, and brute endurance, moving only as far as daylight and warmth allowed, retreating quickly at the first signs of danger or cold, their nights fragmented by fear, hunger, and discomfort. But with fire, the entire paradigm of survival shifted, because warmth, light, and protection could now be extended across space and time, allowing humans to plan, experiment, and adapt in ways that were previously impossible. And as the glow of the flame became central to camps, hunters could venture farther, testing traps and ambushes in the semi-light of embers or torches, while scouts could observe animal patterns over extended periods without immediate risk, learning behaviors, migration paths, and vulnerabilities that informed strategy. And the capacity to store embers or carry fire over distances allowed groups to establish forward outposts, temporary shelters, and safe zones, transforming the landscape from a purely hostile environment into a territory that could be mapped, understood, and partially controlled. And with this ability to manipulate environment and time came experimentation with tools, techniques and methods. For fire allowed meat to be cooked, bones to be hardened, hides to be treated, and plants to be softened, processed, or rendered safe, all of which expanded dietary options, preserved food, and increased mobility. And as these techniques were refined, humans began to observe patterns of prey, correlating movement with season, weather, and geography, while also using fire actively in hunting itself, through controlled burns to drive animals toward traps, lights to disorient nocturnal creatures, or smoke to mask scent and direction, integrating fire into a complex, anticipatory strategy rather than a reactive one. And this approach required coordination, memory, communication, and shared planning, as multiple hunters and observers had to act in unison, track progress, and adjust in real time, teaching the earliest lessons in leadership, teamwork, and strategic thinking. And the winter brought additional challenges, for cold could immobilize, deplete energy, and reduce survival odds. But fire allowed humans to endure otherwise lethal temperatures, providing warmth for extended periods, allowing sleep cycles to normalize even in freezing conditions, and creating spaces where children, elders, and weaker members could survive while hunters explored or gathered resources. And the combination of warmth, light, and controlled environment permitted longer observation of the environment, leading to innovations in shelter construction, insulation with hides, the layering of materials, the creation of windbreaks, and the selection of microclimates for camps that maximized warmth and minimized energy expenditure. And through these adaptations, humans learned that preparation, foresight, and manipulation of resources could dramatically increase survival rates, transforming winter from a time of mere endurance into an opportunity for strategic growth, learning, and experimentation. And in parallel, fire encouraged technological advancement, as the capacity to cook meat, soften hides, harden wood, and manipulate materials under heat allowed tools to become more complex, specialized, and effective, enabling humans to hunt larger prey, process more food, and craft implements that enhance daily life and survival efficiency. And these developments were reinforced through social teaching, observation, and imitation, creating a feedback loop in which fire-driven innovation propagated rapidly across the tribe, increasing adaptability, resilience, and collective knowledge. And as groups experimented with fire-driven strategies, mental faculties evolved, supporting abstract thought, planning, memory, and risk assessment, allowing humans to approach survival not as a series of isolated, reactive incidents, but as an interconnected system of strategy, innovation, and foresight. And through repeated cycles of challenge and adaptation, the cognitive and social capacities of humans were amplified, fostering ingenuity, collaboration, and leadership. And as these patterns became habitual, the tribe developed a shared culture of survival, embedded in the rituals of fire tending, hunting preparation, storytelling, and observation, ensuring that knowledge was preserved, transmitted, and improved over generations. And in this way, fire did not simply protect or sustain life. It expanded it, enhancing mobility, ingenuity, endurance, and collective intelligence, allowing humans to thrive in extreme environments, manipulate resources with foresight, and innovate in ways that set the stage for all future cultural, technological, and social advancement. proving that mastery of flame was not merely a tool for warmth or light, but the engine of human evolution, a catalyst that transformed instinct into strategy, fear into preparation, and cold, dark landscapes into arenas for ingenuity, coordination, and resilience. And the patterns developed around fire-driven survival continue to echo through human civilization today, from coordinated hunting practices to communal planning, from shelter construction to resource management, all rooted in the profound influence of fire on intelligence, adaptability, and social cohesion. As the story of fire unfolded across generations, it became clear that this simple element was far more than warmth, light, or a tool for survival. It was the heartbeat of human evolution, a force that transformed every aspect of life, for with fire came safety, allowing humans to rest without constant vigilance, to sleep more deeply, to recover energy and cognitive clarity, and to begin perceiving patterns in nature that had previously gone unnoticed. And with safety and warmth came social cohesion, because sitting around the glowing embers required cooperation, trust, and shared responsibility, forming roles that defined the tribe, teaching accountability, leadership, and interdependence. And as humans nurtured the flame, they nurtured one another, creating circles of life in which knowledge, skills, and memory could be transmitted with unprecedented fidelity. And the fire's glow encouraged imagination as shadows flickered on cave walls. Sparks drifted into the night, and smoke rose toward the stars, prompting humans to connect patterns, visualize outcomes, anticipate threats, and envision possibilities beyond immediate survival. And this cognitive expansion was mirrored in ritual, song, storytelling, and symbolic practice, as the circle of fire became a stage for communal learning, moral instruction, and celebration, embedding lessons of hunting, gathering, survival, and social norms in forms that were memorable, emotionally resonant, and culturally binding. And fire also catalyzed technological innovation, allowing humans to manipulate materials, harden tools, prepare food, process hides, and experiment with methods that enhanced both efficiency and security, expanding their territory, increasing adaptability, and fostering strategic thinking. And in winter, the power of fire transformed what had once been a season of fragility and fear into a period of planning, observation, and controlled activity, enabling humans to explore frozen lands, test hunting strategies, and maintain community cohesion in the harshest conditions. And over countless cycles, these intertwined effects of fire on sleep, social structure, imagination, ritual, innovation, and strategic survival created a compounding legacy. For humans learned to perceive the night not as enemy, but as a stage, to treat each challenge as an opportunity, and to coordinate efforts across time and space in ways that no other species had. And the cognitive, social, and cultural benefits reinforce one another, with secure sleep allowing sharper observation and creativity, with social bonds facilitating coordinated hunting and fire management, with ritual reinforcing memory and shared identity, with imagination driving toolmaking and planning, with innovation feeding survival and mobility. And with every successful application of fire, the circle of human knowledge expanded, establishing the foundations for language, culture, and civilization itself. And as fire was carried from cave to cave, from valley to valley, from generation to generation, it became both a physical and symbolic conduit for continuity, transmitting wisdom, norms, and practices that ensured humans did not merely survive, but thrived, learning to manipulate their environment, anticipate challenges, and construct societies. And the lessons of fire also shaped morality and social consciousness, because tending a flame meant valuing life collectively, prioritizing safety and comfort not only for oneself but for children, elders, and the community. And these lessons extended outward, influencing hunting ethics, sharing practices, and cooperative strategies that became embedded in culture. And with imagination enhanced by the fire, humans began to create symbolic representations, myth, and art, encoding experience into forms that could inspire, teach, and unify. And this symbolic capacity magnified the impact of ritual, storytelling, and knowledge transfer, reinforcing the benefits already gained from improved sleep, strategic thinking, and social organization. And through these intertwined systems, humans achieved a level of adaptability, creativity, and cohesion unparalleled in the natural world, forging a legacy in which fire served as both a literal and figurative center, shaping physiology, cognition, culture, and community simultaneously. And by mastering fire, humans learned to transform chaos into order, fear into strategy, cold into comfort, darkness into light, solitude into social bonds, instinct into foresight, survival into culture, and biological life into enduring civilization. And the echoes of this transformation are still visible today in our structured sleep, communal living, technological innovation, artistic expression, cultural rituals, and moral systems, all of which trace back to the primal circle of warmth and light where cavemen first gathered around the glow of fire, discovering that to tend a flame was to tend life itself, to nurture mind, body, and community, to transform survival into mastery, and to leave a legacy that would endure across millennia, a legacy in which humans became the architects of their destiny, the innovators of their environment, and the creators of culture, and all of it rooted in the simple, extraordinary act of discovering that fire could be carried, preserved, shared, and revered, a force that turned the harshest nights into incubators of intelligence, society, and imagination, and ensured that the human story, ignited by a single spark, would blaze onward forever.